everybody, and welcome to today's webinar presentation, which is hosted by the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations at Coventry University. Today's presentation is on world peace and how we can achieve it. Just a reminder that this webinar presentation is part of a series that is hosted by the Centre, and this is the last presentation we have for this year, but stay tuned for some exciting presentations coming up in the new year. And now I'm going to hand over to the chair of today's event, which is the Centre's director, Sir Ciarán Devane. So I'll hand it over to you, Ciarán.
Thanks, Stephen, and welcome everyone. And welcome in particular to Professor Alex Bellamy for one of the really important topics. I think one that's very close to sort of what I care about and worry about. I remember sitting in class probably 15 years ago doing a master's in Washington, DC, and debating the right to protect. And within the context of the professor now in Stanford, Carola Weil, who had been working in the post-genocide work in Rwanda, and just the big debate that we all entered into at that point about what was the right of a state, the duty on humanity to intervene in those areas. And I think the topic of preventing mass atrocities, you know, the reframing of the duty of the international community through the right to protect, someone may be backsliding, I might suggest, which is taking place on that for various reasons, is one of the really big topics in the field for the likes of us at CTPSR and other places. Alex himself, he's a professor. He's the founder of the Asia Pacific Center for the Right to Protect. He's on the high-level panel for Southeast Asia on right to protect. He's a much published writer. I think, is it 28 books, 140 book chapters, half a gazillion papers, really an expert in this. And he's one of the people who can be a scholar in international politics and international affairs, and also a scholar in peace studies. So really wonderful to have you with us. When Stephen and I were talking last night, we decided that we wanted to be you when we grew up, Alex, was what we decided. So with that, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Ciarán, and thanks for that really generous introduction, and thanks to you too, Stephen. And though I wouldn't inflict being me when you grow up on anyone, I think there would be an obligation to protect you from that. And it's a real pleasure to be talking to you this evening and your morning, and really appreciate you taking the time to host me. And it's a particular pleasure to be talking at Coventry University. Back in the day when I was doing my undergraduate degree and master's, I spent many summers working in a factory in Coventry, and so I have many happy memories of time spent in Coventry. And I'm not ashamed to admit that I did in fact develop a love of speedway when I was in Coventry, and used to spend Saturday nights down watching the Coventry Bees. Always the great competition with Wolverhampton, I think, was the big local rival. So it's a real pleasure, and thanks so much. Great, thanks very much. So what I'm going to talk about today is linked to my work on the responsibility to protect. There was a project that I wrote up for a book that was published a couple of years ago with the unambitious title of World Peace and How We Can Achieve It. So everything you need to know about world peace in less than 250 pages. Problem solved. Well, no, not really. So why did I take on writing a book about world peace? And the quote at the top there is, the reception that I got almost every time I mentioned I was writing this book to anyone, be they an academic, an activist, or a family member, when they said, "Oh, what are you working on now?" And I said, "Well, I'm working on a book on world peace." And so these were the responses that I got. As Ciarán mentioned in his introduction, for the last 15 years, I've been director of the Asia Pacific Center for R2P. And for about half of that time, I've also been a consultant for the United Nations working on atrocity prevention, and have done things like draft reports for the UN Secretary General on the responsibility to protect. So much of that work has been very kind of hands-on, very policy focused both on the Asia Pacific region and globally. And the genesis for this book starts with a little story and a little trip to Switzerland with my friend and a friend there, Roland Bleicher. Some of you may remember a few years ago, the Brussels bombings. I was in Brussels, just down the road from one of those bombings on the day of the bombings. I was actually there in my capacity as a consultant for the UN, talking to the EU on a meeting about the prevention of violent extremism and how we can extend ideas related to the responsibility to protect to territories controlled by non-state armed groups. Now, for reasons entirely unconnected with ISIS or what else was going on in Brussels, I managed to get myself into a Brussels hospital that night and stayed in a Brussels hospital for a week. And then Roland, who's a colleague here at UQ, who was staying with his family in Switzerland at the time, came to Brussels and brought me back home to Switzerland to recuperate for a couple of weeks before I made the flight home. And Roland is a postmodernist theorist of nonviolence who doesn't have a television, but he has a very eclectic range of books. So in my time in Switzerland with Roland, I had access to his range of books and spent 2 weeks thinking and reading. And what became clear in that time, sort of a rare moment away from the sort of the day-to-day work, is that as important as things like the responsibility to protect were, even if we succeeded in everything that we were hoping to achieve, and we're very far from succeeding with everything we were hoping to achieve, but even if we succeeded, R2P and other similar principles would always just be a band-aid on a problem. And that unless we tackle the underlying sources of war, conflict, and atrocities, there was always going to be some sort of crisis, some sort of emergency somewhere. And it's always going to be the case that responses and prevention and protection is going to be imperfect. Yet when we ask that big question of world peace, we're confronted by this problem that, well, nobody really believes in it or studies it these days. Not even in departments of peace studies or degrees on peace studies do we give serious attention to the question of world peace and how it might be achieved. And because of that, there were then real limits on things like R2P and atrocity prevention. We were never going to see the sorts of structural changes needed to reduce the incidence of armed conflict and atrocity crimes. It became apparent as well, and in the writing of this book, it became apparent that the questions posed were growing increasingly urgent and increasingly central, that unless we tackle these questions, we weren't going to make significant and structural progress. So this is why I decided to take on this question and think about, well, what do we know about the conditions that make peace possible? What do we know about the big structural forces that drive war? And so the aim for the book as a whole, to put it a bit coyly, was to reclaim the idea of world peace from the beauty pageants, to try to make world peace a subject of serious study, research, and debate once again, so that perhaps when we talk about studying or thinking about world peace, people won't immediately believe or say that you're crazy, deluded, naive, or a hippie. Now, because I tend to get a bit carried away and overexcited, I tend to talk for too long, and I've stripped this back to the bare bones to try and make sure we've got plenty of time for discussion. But I thought, to preempt the possibility of talking for too long, I'd set out in fairly bold terms, the case that I make in the book. And there are 4 key elements of the argument that I make in the book. The first and the overarching argument is that world peace is possible. Not that it's likely, not that we're heading in the right direction, much less that it's imminent, but that it is possible. Not also, I should say, that I think that it's a permanent condition. It's something that can be achieved once and for all. It's something that would need to be achieved over and over and over again and continually striven for and worked for, but it is possible. The second thing is that actually when we look at the research produced by peace and conflict scholars, international relations scholars, sociologists, historians, and we boil down the key questions and we look at the evidence, it turns out we actually know an awful lot of what states, societies, civil societies, individuals, and international institutions need to do in order to make the world more peaceful. We have an awful lot of guidance on this. This reminds me of things that used to come up a lot in discussions at the UN, where I frequently found myself arguing, but rather than thinking about new resolutions, new mandates, new sets of recommendations, we should actually focus more attention on simply implementing the things that we already have on the books. And if we did that, we might find that we made quite a bit of progress. And that's the second thing I want to say, that we know a lot about what we need to do. The third thing, which is related to the second, is that actually we have many, if not most, of the rules and institutions needed to make the world a much more peaceful place. We have detailed and comprehensive international laws. We have global institutions with comprehensive mandates. And as I mentioned before, if those institutions fulfill their mandates to the full, then actually that alone would make a significant difference. The fourth thing, which stems from what I was talking about just a moment ago, is that if we accept that, then we ought to make world peace something that we research, we debate, we argue about, and strive towards. And so in the book, I've tried to be deliberately provocative and to paint in deliberately broad brush strokes, which is kind of an inevitable consequence of a book like this. But that's also because part of the ambition of the book is to stimulate debate, stimulate research, stimulate people to prove why I'm wrong, why alternative approaches might be better. So that's the overall case that I make in the book. Now, why do I think world peace is possible? Is it because, I had a fall on the head? Well, no, it's not. And there are lots of reasons why world peace is possible, but three that I think are really pertinent. The first is that actually, if we look at the span of human history, peace is much more common than we tend to think it is. Because historians and political scientists focus so heavily on war, and we count war and we add up the years of war, we delude ourselves into thinking that war is much more common than peace, much more pervasive than peace. If actually we look at places that aren't experiencing war, if we count it up for days, weeks, months, and years that societies are not in war, what we find is that actually peace is much more the norm than we tend to think of it. Think of, for example, the bloodthirsty years of ancient Greece, where the Spartans and the Athenians and the Thebans were forever going off to war with each other. Well, that's the picture we get from Thucydides and others. But actually the campaigning season, even in the middle of a war, the campaigning season in ancient Greece was somewhere between 4 and 6 weeks long. So for 46 weeks of the year, even when Greek city-states are at war, most, if not everyone in those city-states were not actually involved in war fighting at all. Similarly, take the imperial peace of Rome, that if you are lucky enough to live inside one of the provinces, and yes, there was perpetual war at the borders of empire, but if you were in one of the provinces and you weren't in a Roman army, the chances were that whole generations would go by without you ever having firsthand experience of war. The second reason is that war and peace are human creations. None of this is written into our DNA. In fact, human proclivity for aggression is only as great as our proclivity for cooperation and peacefulness. These are things that arise as a result of the way we organize our societies, the way we arrange our political systems. As such, they can be manipulated because these things are human creations. They're not things born in nature. And as human creations, they can be manipulated in certain ways to achieve certain effects. And the third reason, which flows from that second, is that change is possible. We can see change over the long term. And of course, there have been famous theories and debates in the past few years about long-term change, but you can also see change much closer to hand as well. Think of, for example, how Japan was transformed from being an aggressive imperialist and fairly militarist state and society into being a largely pacifist state in the space of one generation. A slightly longer transformation occurred, for example, in Sweden. Sweden was once one of Europe's more aggressive, militaristic and imperialist states. Today, very few people would attach any of those labels to Sweden. So change over the long term and the short term is possible, and really quite profound change as well. So those are the three reasons why I think world peace is possible. But we need to, I think, be hard-headed when we're thinking about world peace. And that's something that people who think about world peace are often accused of not being. They're accused of being utopians, of being a bit away with the fairies. And part of the problem is that sometimes thinkers on world peace haven't been terribly hard-headed. In particular, they've tended to misunderstand the things that drive war, and to see war as either pathological, irrational, as just evil, or just the rich manipulating the poor. That because they come from a starting point that peace is inevitably good, and war is inevitably bad, often we fail to understand why it is people would choose war over peace, and thus to write it off as irrationality or evil or pathology. And we think that the more we shout at people about why they're wrong, then eventually they're surely going to agree with us and change their ways. But of course, that's not what happens. And sadly, in the history of peace activism, there are all sorts of examples of peace activism going awry because it's informed by this view of war as irrational, or war as a pathology. And one example that really kind of caught my eye, because the period of between kind of 1913 and 1915 is so iconic in the history of the peace movement, in that in 1913-14, the European peace movement was at a level never seen before in terms of mass membership of peace societies, in terms of mass activism for peace. And yet all of that was torn away very, very quickly with the escalation to war in 1914. Now, a good example of how peace activism sometimes goes astray is Henry Ford's peace ship. So Henry Ford decided that he could apply his business acumen to the goal of world peace. And so he commissioned a ship in New York, filled it with peace activists, and set sail for Europe with the view that they'd arrive in Europe, negotiate a peaceful end to the First World War, and thus demonstrate the wisdom of peace. Of course, you know, as anyone who's spent more than a couple of hours in a room with a dozen peace activists know, what inevitably happened is that the peace activists couldn't agree with each other about what to do. They split into factions. Disease broke up on the ship, and it never actually made it to mainland Europe. It docked in Ireland. Henry Ford got off, and quite a few others got off. A couple of people died of disease, and the whole thing ended in disarray. And as I mentioned before, this came at a kind of a critical moment for peace studies, and something that, you know, I think is still worth paying attention to. That we went from a situation in 1913-14 where we had these huge peace societies, and yet it got swept away by what Stefan Zweig calls an awakening of the masses. And he was, of course, a pacifist himself. We think of, for example, the reaction of the Pankhursts and the suffragist movement to pacifism in 1914-15. Christabel Pankhurst was the most forthright in her views, but she was not alone in that either. So this is a call that we need to be kind of hard-headed in thinking about world peace. And that's what I've tried to do in this book. And I've done that by starting by thinking of that question, well, why is it then that war has proven so resilient? Why does war persist? And I'm not thinking here of kind of working through the causes of individual wars, but rather what are the big structural phenomena that make war persist as a social action. And I think there are three key underlying reasons. The first is that, like it or not, we humans are divided into different political groups, And like it or not, those different political groups do have different interests and different values. And when they find they can't resolve or accommodate those interests and values, war and violence remains a way of determining the outcome of disputes. It's the ultimate conflict resolver in a way. Secondly, we can't dispute the fact that war has often proven itself to be useful or profitable. Most of the great powers of today are great powers of today because they've proven effective in war. You know, the story of European colonialism is well known. American colonialism is similarly well written, but China too is a land colonial power. China became China through military conquest of places like Xinjiang and Tibet and elsewhere. Bashar al-Assad is still president of Syria because he used war and flattened half his country to remain president of Syria. That was the only way he was going to achieve that. War historically has delivered great riches to some people. Of course, it's proven catastrophic for many others, but nonetheless, we can't write it off as irrational because for some people, war has proven to be highly profitable and to serve their interests, and it continues to do so. And the third reason why war persists is that war is sadly contagious. I mean this in two senses. Firstly, research on the causes of civil war show us that one of the factors that makes a country particularly vulnerable to civil war is the presence of a civil war in another country. And there's all sorts of reasons why we have those spillover effects. The other way in which I mean it is that the contagion of war means that it's very hard for single states or groups of states to renounce war as a tool, because other states will likely take advantage of that. And the states that renounce war will eventually find themselves having to choose between resorting to war again or succumbing to a powerful neighbor. Now, of course, there are exceptions. Costa Rica is one right now. The Phoenicians in the Middle East were able to survive for quite a few centuries without having their own army. They did build ships for the Greeks and did supply ships to the Persians. So, you know, they had a bet both ways when the Greeks and the Persians came to blows in order to keep themselves out of the direct confrontation. But nonetheless, it seems clear that war is contagious. So even where you have small pockets or groups of societies that decide to opt out of war, sooner or later in the long span of history, war does tend to catch up with them. Now, I've talked for a bit too long already, so I'll skip over the note on religion. The point being quickly that Richard Dawkins is wrong to say that religion is a key driver of war. Its role is actually much more ambivalent than that. So that's war. What then are the building blocks of world peace? The first thing that I want to say, and I'm going to come back to this point in a moment, is that world peace isn't a kind of a single thing built in a single way by a single set of institutions. It's something that, if it's achieved at all, is achieved through the accumulation of what the historian Jay Winter called minor utopias. That is the persistent work towards peace done by lots of different actors in different ways, in different contexts. And it's the accumulation of all of those things that builds towards world peace. And so the recommendations that I'm going to suggest at the end, which are followed Immanuel Kant's model that he used in Perpetual Peace, they're not a sort of a blueprint for how you get there. They're more a framework for how do we build the conditions in which these minor utopias can start to happen. That said, I think there are three big building blocks along the way. One is the state, another is to do with the economics of war and peace, and the third is to do with emotions and the emotional drives to war and emotional impulses of compassion and inclusivity. So I'll quickly go through these and then get to the key points at the end. And I'll go very quickly through here, so we've got plenty of time for discussion. Firstly, the state. We all know that the process of state making itself was hugely violent and problematic. But it's also very clear that over the long term, the rise of modern states has been associated with overall declines of violence. And that's however you want to measure violence, with the exception, I would add, of gender-based violence, where data more than 10 or 15 years past is so bad, we just don't know. But where we have data around war and armed conflict and around homicide and criminal violence, the trends are very clear everywhere in relation to the rise of the modern state. Another way of measuring the impact of the modern state would be to look at the other side and look at life expectancy. And again, there we can see that the rise of the modern state is associated with all sorts of developments that have prolonged life, so that expectancy has gone up. That said, we know that some types of states have been more effective at achieving these effects than other types. And what a rather extensive literature, much of it using very complicated quantitative methods and all sorts of different data sets. But if we can boil that down to things that literature largely agrees on, there are 5 key attributes of what we might call a peace supporting state. They have a monopoly of legitimate violence. They have a government of laws that is accountable to the people, usually through democratic process. They protect the human rights of individuals and groups. They guarantee a degree of basic economic justice, and they promote and protect gender equality. I'll come back to those things in a moment. The second aspect is the economics. Now, if war was driven or is driven by the material benefits that it provides, it stands to reason that if those benefits decline, so our interest in war will decline too. And that was the key argument of some of the earliest modern theorists of world peace, people like Jean Bloch and Norman Angell. Bloch in particular is a really interesting character that I wish I had more time to go into, but I don't, but it's well worth looking up. But the whole argument was modern war is going to become so expensive that states won't be able to achieve their goals through using war, and it will become counterproductive, and therefore they'll move away from war. Now, a lot of people say, how? Well, you wrote this before the First World War. The First World War shows that you're wrong. Actually, I think the First World War vindicates Bloch, because look at what happened to the states that went to war in the First World War. The Russian Empire collapsed, the German Empire collapsed, the Austrian Empire collapsed, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and the British and French empires were fundamentally weakened. So I think there is something to say about his argument. Now, the interesting thing, of course, with the economics of war is that these costs and payoffs can be shaped and manipulated. We can make arms more expensive and difficult to acquire. We can look at ways of increasing the opportunity costs through economic development, trade, and integration. We could also do things by making sure we erode war's political utility by enforcing a ban on aggression and annexation, for example, which is why, for example, I think holding the line on Crimea is absolutely essential, because as soon as you start to relax the ban on annexation, you actually trigger a key incentive for states to think about returning to war. The third element is to do with the emotions and passions of war. And I put this quote up by George Orwell because it's one of my favorite quotes of all time. And it captures beautifully how identity, emotions, values change people's priorities and the way they see their interests in conditions of war. If Clausewitz was right, and war was really just policy by other means, it would have been abolished long before now, because it's really not a very effective means of getting what you want. But Clausewitz wasn't right, because we know war is driven by powerful emotions, identities, sense of belongings, and purpose. We also know that it's not that there are kind of bad emotions and good emotions. We know that positive emotions like love and empathy can work both ways. They can promote peace and promote war as well. We also know that the wider support for war is driven by an often distorted image and trivialization of war. So countering that by focusing on building passions for peace is a really important element of building world peace, through things like reinforcing the idea of human equality. one of the best and earliest peace activists, Jane Addams, worked on building bonds of friendship across difference at local levels. Virginia Woolf and others since have said, we need to peel back the veil of war, show people what war actually does to people, which will make them much less enthusiastic about going to war. Equally important, I think, is the protection of dissent. Whatever you think about people's positions, one of the things that often happens during war is that dissent gets closed down immediately, and that pushes emotions in a certain direction and prevents the consideration of other alternatives. So it's really essential that people are allowed to follow their conscience. So what I'm going to do is suggest stealing Immanuel Kant's model, some paths to peace that I think could create a framework for building minor utopias that, when multiplied, could make the world more peaceful. And so, following Kant, I've broken these down into preliminary articles and definitive articles, and I've added one extra at the end, which I've called the Lorax article. The preliminary articles are things that use institutions and laws we already have and basically say, if we just concentrated on making these work to the full, that would make a significant difference. The definitive articles are two bigger sets of reforms that would make a much more, a deeper difference. And then the Lorax principle gives an indication of how we might start to get there. So my 6 preliminary articles. The first one is simply, don't violate existing international law relating to the use of force. And UN Security Council, the permanent members should fulfill the role given to them by the UN Charter and assume their primary responsibility for international peace and security. The second, which is related to the first, is that when the Security Council is doing this, or other UN bodies are doing this, every state should contribute its fair share to the implementation of those decisions. They should provide peacekeepers, they should provide funding, they should provide civilian staff, and they should provide political support to achieve the things that are already on the books. Thirdly, no one should transfer arms to anyone who may be reasonably expected to use them in violation of international law. Again, this is not pie in the sky stuff. This is the Arms Trade Treaty. We have a treaty that says pretty much this. It has some gaps in it. We can close those gaps. We can work to get more states to sign on to it, and we can concentrate on implementation. Fourth, I think it's very, very clear that regional security organizations and security communities make a big impact. Obviously, the European Union is the best example, but in my region, ASEAN is another very, very good example of how regional security communities that build stronger, positive security relationships between neighbors can make a real and important difference. Fifthly, is turning to individual human rights and the idea of a universal right to hospitality. That is, we should allow the free and fair movement of goods, services, people, and critically ideas between states, so that you build cooperation, you build understanding, you build webs of interconnection. And sixthly, individuals should be held criminally accountable for genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and aggression. Again, that's the International Criminal Court. So this is an article that simply says, let's run the ICC's writ globally and let's hold individuals to account. And that knowledge that they are likely to be held to account if they commit any of those crimes would likely impact on their decision-making. So those are the preliminary articles. My big 3 definitive articles then, these are longer term, big structural changes. One is I'm envisioning world peace still based in a world of states, because we are different. We do have different interests. We do have different values, and people find the best democratic expression within their own political community. But these states should be capable, responsible, and legitimate in their sovereignty. We should strive towards a world of states that have those 5 attributes I talked about earlier. One of those attributes I've singled out, and that's gender equality. And there's a reason why I've singled that out, and it's because the data we have shows that of all the different factors, gender equality is the one that correlates most closely with peacefulness. That is, the more gender equal a society is, the more peaceful it's likely to be. Now, academics are still working out precisely why that is, But that same result has appeared again and again and again with different data sets, different measures. So I think that's worth singling out and highlighting. And the third thing goes to the point that I made when I was talking about the passions of war and the protection of dissent. And that is, I don't think anyone should be obligated or forced to fight a war that they don't believe is just or that they object to. So I think there should be a universal right of conscientious objection, that any individual, even if they're serving in the armed forces, should have a right to conscientious objection. I think that would force governments to have to make, and non-state actors to have to make a stronger case for why they need to fight particular wars. Because of course, if they fail to make a strong case, they're going to find it difficult to mobilize the support they need. Then finally, the LawRex article, because none of this is going to happen by itself. It will happen only if people put pressure on governments, on international organizations, on civil society organizations to make some of these things happen. And that's going to happen in lots and lots of different ways, by fostering open and honest public deliberation about the causes of war, the reasons for going to war, reasons to not go to war, by holding public institutions accountable. And I must say, the UK Parliament has done a much better job of that in relation to Iraq and Afghanistan than the Australian Parliament has, by organizing campaigns for peace, by embodying peace in the everyday, and by, through the work we do, fostering that transnational sphere of interaction, engagement, and cooperation that can start to change attitudes. And I've called it the LawRex article because, of course, as everyone knows in a famous Dr. Seuss book, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. Thanks very much.
Brilliant, Alex. Thank you for that. As ever, a huge amount in there. And I gave an inaugural lecture just over a week ago, and I quoted you along with Scilla Ellsworthy, because both of you were saying the same kind of thing, that positive peace is a process. It's about how people interact. It's about, do you have the basics in place, and that you have to put in the legwork, not when there's a war on, but over the decades when there isn't, to reduce the probabilities. But I was struck by what you were saying about a lot of the things that we talk about and worry about the erosion of the strength of democracy in particular countries, whether it's the United States or, Hungary, people would mention as well, is around the erosion of the norms and the sort of those basic things which you have to work on if you're going to create peace. And if you neglect them, then you're open to exploitation. So if I'm allowed one question before we open it up, it's how worried should we be about the country, what we used to call the West, where we were, we're the nice people, we're growing, we're prospering, we're bringing sort of, peace to the world by contributing the resources. But if that phrase, and God forbid, Trump had overturned an election result in the US, for example, how worried should we be about those underpinnings, which are the ones you were saying we need to work on, but actually, if we look at it, maybe they're going the wrong way?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think in some sense, and I'm going to give you a classic academic answer. So I'm going to say in some sense, we should be very worried. And in some other senses, not as worried as maybe some of us have become. So I think we should be very worried in that, because as you say, there are kind of key norms and principles that are becoming eroded around democracy, around core human rights, around things like truth. One of the things that I've noticed in my time, particularly working with the UN, is that states can no longer even agree on basic facts. And if you can't agree on basic facts, you can't debate, contest, find compromise, strive for common ground, because you don't even agree on the basic kind of meat and bones of what it is you're talking about. So if I compare debates in the UN about Bosnia with debates on Syria, Bosnia was equally fractious, but there was a common understanding that, if a UN rapporteur or the head of UN humanitarian relief sat in the UN Security Council and told the council what was happening and what the numbers were, people would accept that. And then they'd argue about, well, what do we need to do about it? Doesn't mean that they'd agree, doesn't mean that they'd come up with the right answer, but they would accept. What we've seen on Syria is the UN officials go in and do that and have states just say, no, you're wrong, that's inaccurate, we object to that. And so you can't even have those sorts of elemental discussions. And we see that too, I think, in Western democracies. There's kind of this post-truth politics, which kind of erodes the possibility even for reaching common ground. And I think the flip side of that is also something that's been sort of turbocharged by social media, which is that as we spend more time talking to people who agree with us, we're finding it much more difficult to talk with people who don't agree with us. We tend to demonize them. We tend to assume that they must be evil or wrong, and if only we shout at them a bit more loudly, then the message will get through. And we're losing some of those basic skills. I think this is over a long time. I'm no expert on American politics, but it's been one of the key structural features. It's gone hand in hand with gerrymandering. But decades ago, you would have Republicans and Democrats crossing over really quite frequently, crossing floors. You'd have centrists on both sides sitting down with each other and talking and hammering out deals. That happens much, much less, which means that US political institutions are very often kind of hamstrung. And I think we see that both in our domestic politics and also in our international politics. And so I am worried about the erosion of those basic norms. And I think we've not yet seen how they're going to play out. On the flip side, though, I'm not one of those who thinks that kind of the root of everything that's wrong with the world lies with the West. I think you can look at policies in the Middle East, particularly Iraq, and we can debate Afghanistan. But most conflicts in most parts of the world right now have very little to do with the West. So we've had this whole debate in the West about endless wars. To actually look at the world's intractable armed conflicts, 2/3 of them have nothing to do with the West at all. They're happening in places like Ethiopia, in places like Sudan, in places. So these are complex conflicts, often caused by things that are going on in country. And I think as internationals, we tend to massively overestimate the impact of international factors on what are often national and local sets of disputes. And my worry is that what happens when we become too critical of the West is that we get a coalition of, if I can put this really crudely, of the right wing that often don't want to do anything other than things that are in the national interest, the left wing who are suspicious of anything that the West does overseas. And that becomes then a compelling argument for not doing anything at all, for sort of sitting on our hands and not taking responsibility. So we saw that really clearly in Syria. We see that in relation to other conflicts. And that's my worry, is that as the West becomes less of a leader on things like human rights, authoritarian states are increasingly taking the lead on a lot of these issues and then eroding a lot of these norms and eroding a lot of the progress made. And this is something that everyone at the UN year on year, it's not just on R2P, it's on ICC, it's on human rights generally, it's on women, peace and security. They can't even get the resolutions and the mandates now that we had 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And that's a worry, I think.
Brilliant. Thank you all for that. So thank you again, Alex, in particular, for giving your evening to us. Very stimulating, huge amount to think about. And I hope we get to do some work together in the future.